The Sioux are one of the largest and oldest Native American tribes in North America, with a history spanning 2 to 3,000 years. At the height of their strength, the Sioux occupied a vast territory covering thousands of square miles, making them one of the most influential and well-known tribes in the history of the United States. The ancestral Sioux likely originated in the central Mississippi Valley region before migrating to what is now Minnesota. Around 800 AD, they settled in the northern forests of central Minnesota and northwestern Wisconsin after moving from the central Mississippi River area. By approximately 1300 AD, they developed the characteristics of a northern tribal society and became organized into the Seven Council Fires, which consisted of 7 bands based on kinship, dialect, and geographic proximity. Today, the Sioux Nation is primarily divided into 3 major groups: the Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota. Some historians suggest that the Nakota were originally part of the Dakota. These groups also represent the 3 main dialects spoken among the Sioux. In all dialects, the terms Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota translate to allies or friends, reflecting the alliances among the bands. Like many Native American tribes, the Sioux believe in a deep connection between all living things, including animals, plants, spirits, and people. They believe the Great Spirit created the universe and embodies all existence as one entity. A central figure in Sioux culture is the white buffalo calf woman, who serves as an intermediary between the Great Spirit and humanity. She introduced the 7 sacred rites, which include the Purification Lodge, crying for vision, sun dance, making of relatives, female puberty ceremony, throwing of the ball, and soul keeping. These ceremonies are vital to preserving the Sioux way of life. Before the 1600s, the Dakota lived in the Lake Superior region, where they hunted wild rice, deer, and buffalo and speared fish from canoes. However, during the 1700s, conflicts with the Ojibway tribe forced the Dakota to migrate to what is now southern and western Minnesota. During this period, the Lakota and Nakota remained in the agricultural territories of Minnesota. Later, they moved westward into the regions now known as North and South Dakota. This migration and reorganization solidified the Sioux's presence in the Great Plains, where they became renowned for their warrior culture and influential role among Native American tribes. As horses became more common on the plains, the Lakota and Nakota shifted away from agriculture and adopted a nomadic lifestyle centered on hunting buffalo. This change aligned them with the cultural characteristics of other nomadic plains native societies. They lived in teepees, wore clothing made from leather, suede, or fur, and relied heavily on buffalo for food, clothing, and tools. They traded buffalo products for corn with farming tribes on the plains, but also frequently raided these tribes, particularly the Mandan, Arikara, Hidatsa, and Pawnee. These raids ultimately led those tribes to form alliances with the U.S. military against the Sioux. Traditional Sioux culture was deeply rooted in community life. The Sioux lived in camps composed of extended families connected by a shared sense of identity and belonging. A designated leader provided guidance and fostered unity within the camp. Daily life revolved around subsistence tasks, with responsibilities divided by age and gender. Men focused on hunting, warfare, and crafting tools and weapons, while also engaging in trading, councils, ceremonies, and leisure activities like horse racing. Women were responsible for gathering wild resources such as prairie turnips, tanning hides, cooking, sewing, creating quillwork designs, and managing household needs. This division of labor ensured the community's survival while preserving cultural traditions and fostering a strong sense of cooperation and identity. In traditional Sioux society, women held significant responsibilities, including breaking camp, packing belongings on a travois, and setting up camp at the end of each day. Older children and youth often gathered firewood and water and tended to horses and dogs, while grandparents and elders took primary responsibility for caring for infants and small children and assisting with household tasks. In Lakota society, men were allowed to have more than one wife, and men of high status frequently had several wives, which was seen as a mark of prestige and responsibility. The Sioux first encountered European settlers in the 1600s, trading with French merchants like many other tribes of the time. This trade was part of the broader competition between the French and English for dominance in the North American fur trade. The Ojibway, Potawatomi, and Ottawa were among the first tribes to engage in trade with the French. The Sioux's initial recorded encounter with the French occurred during the winter of 1659 to 1660 when explorers Médard de Groseilliers and Pierre-Esprit Radisson reached what is now Wisconsin. The relationship between the Sioux and the Ojibway was complex, marked by both conflict and cooperation. In 1679, the Sioux and Ojibway formed an alliance through peaceful diplomacy at Fond du Lac in present-day Minnesota. As part of the agreement, the Ojibway provided the Sioux with goods from the fur trade, while the Sioux allowed the Ojibway to move westward toward the Mississippi River. This period of peace, which lasted for 57 years, fostered mutual prosperity. The two tribes often hunted together, shared religious experiences, intermarried, and created families, strengthening their bonds during this era of cooperation. Over time, tensions between the Dakota Sioux and the Ojibway grew as the Dakota began to resent the Ojibway's alliances with their hereditary enemies, the Cree and Assiniboine, with whom the Dakota were at war. French traders further exacerbated the conflict by playing both sides against each other to maintain their influence in the fur trade. By the 1720s, these tensions had escalated, leading to open conflict in 1736. By this time, the Sioux no longer relied on the Ojibway to supply them with trade goods and began to view the Ojibway as unwelcome intruders on their lands. However, the Ojibway, who had lived in the region for nearly 3 generations, were unwilling to leave and chose to fight for the territory they had initially entered as guests. The resulting Sioux-Ojibway War became one of the longest-lasting conflicts in North American history. The war created a standing front that stretched from central Wisconsin through Minnesota to the Red River of the North. This blockade severely disrupted travel and trade along these routes, forcing fur traders to use safer, more northern paths. This shift benefited the Cree and Ojibway, who gained more control over northern trade routes, while it blocked European access to the Sioux market. The Ojibway expanded their territory, taking control of waterways from Grand Portage to Rainy Lake, where their main settlement was established. From this strategic position, they pushed south towards Sioux settlements around Leech Lake, Red Lake, and Sandy Lake. Within 40 years, the Ojibway controlled much of northern Minnesota. One of the larger and more notable battles of this conflict occurred in 1770 at the Dalles of the St. Croix River. According to historian William Whipple Warren, the fighting began when the Meskwaki tribe, hereditary enemies of the Ojibway, attacked them near St. Croix Falls. The Sioux eventually joined the battle, escalating the violence. This battle marked a significant moment in the ongoing war, reflecting the deep-seated rivalries and shifting alliances that shaped the region's history. As the Dakota Sioux faced encroachment by the Ojibway, tensions escalated into violent confrontations. One notable battle occurred when the Dakota allied with the Meskwaki to attack the Ojibway. The Meskwaki engaged the Ojibway first, boasting that they would easily defeat their enemies. Initially, the Dakota and Meskwaki had the upper hand, but Ojibway reinforcements arrived, turning the tide of the battle. Although both the Sioux and Ojibway suffered heavy losses, the Meskwaki were left with the greatest number of casualties. The Ojibway emerged victorious, securing control of the upper St. Croix and establishing an informal boundary around the mouth of the Snake River. As a result, the Dakota were forced to relinquish traditional lands around Leech Lake and Mill Lacs and move southward along the Mississippi and St. Croix River valleys. This period of conflict prompted cultural adaptations among the Sioux divisions. The Lakota and Nakota migrated westward onto the prairies, adopting the nomadic lifestyle of plains tribes, including a reliance on buffalo hunting and the use of horses. The Dakota, meanwhile, retained many cultural elements of their woodland heritage. By 1803, the Sioux had divided into 3 distinct groups: Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota, each adapting to their environments while maintaining strong cultural ties. As colonial expansion pushed westward past the Mississippi River in the mid-19th century, the Sioux fiercely resisted further incursions. The California Gold Rush of 1849 brought waves of settlers, while the U.S. government sought to establish routes like the Bozeman Trail through Sioux territory. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 promised safe passage for settlers along the Oregon Trail, but tensions boiled over in 1854 when a Mormon settler's cow wandered into a Sioux camp. Misunderstandings escalated, and Lieutenant John Grattan led an armed force into the village, resulting in a confrontation that ended with Chief Conquering Bear's death and the annihilation of Grattan's detachment by the Sioux. Retaliation came swiftly. In 1855, General William S. Harney led 600 troops to overrun a Sioux village at Blue Water, killing 85 people and capturing 70 women and children. Meanwhile, in the east, settlers increasingly demanded Sioux lands. The Dakota War of 1862 began as the Sioux, led by Chief Little Crow, raided settlements and forts, including Fort Ridgely. Despite initial successes, the Sioux were eventually overpowered by General Henry Sibley's troops. At the Battle of Wood Lake, Sioux forces were decimated by artillery. Survivors fled to Dakota Territory or Canada, while 38 captured Dakota Sioux were hanged in Mankato, Minnesota, on December 26, 1862, in the largest mass execution in U.S. history. After the Civil War, a new route, the Bozeman Trail, was established to shorten the journey to Montana. This trail, however, cut through key Sioux and Cheyenne hunting grounds, igniting further resistance. The Sioux allied with the Northern Cheyenne and Arapaho to raid settlers and military patrols. In 1866, Red Cloud and other Sioux leaders met with U.S. officials at Fort Laramie to negotiate. While some chiefs signed a non-aggression treaty, Red Cloud refused and prepared for war. The Army sought to secure the trail by reinforcing Fort Reno and constructing Fort Phil Kearny and Fort C.F. Smith. Crazy Horse used clever tactics to ambush soldiers, including Captain William Fetterman's 80-man detachment, which was completely annihilated. Although the Army sent reinforcements equipped with breech-loading rifles, the Sioux inflicted heavy casualties. Ultimately, the government abandoned its efforts to secure the Bozeman Trail, especially as the Transcontinental Railroad, south of the Platte River, neared completion. The signing of the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 marked a significant turning point in the conflict between the Sioux and the U.S. government. The treaty granted Red Cloud's demand for the abandonment of the Bozeman forts in exchange for ceasing raids. Once the forts were vacated, the Sioux set them ablaze as a symbolic act of reclaiming their land. However, the arrival of the railroad introduced new challenges. The expansion frightened the buffalo herds, a crucial resource for the Plains tribes, while soldiers and settlers hunted the animals to near extinction. By the 1870s, violations of the Fort Laramie Treaty by both sides further escalated tensions, compounded by the discovery of gold in 1874 in the Sioux' Sacred Black Hills. This event sparked renewed fighting as Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse led native resistance against U.S. forces. The conflict intensified in 1876 when the U.S. military demanded that all native hunting bands return to reservations or be declared hostiles. The Sioux and Cheyenne warriors won an early victory at Montana's Powder River in March, inflicting heavy casualties on the Army. However, a larger campaign followed in the late spring, with a three-pronged strategy involving General George Crook from the south, Colonel John Gibbon from the west, and General Alfred Terry with Colonel George A. Custer from the east. On June 17, 1876, Crazy Horse and 700 warriors attacked Crook's 1,000-man force, driving them back with numerous casualties. The Sioux and Cheyenne regrouped at a large encampment near the Little Bighorn River, known as Greasy Grass. By late June, the encampment housed around 7,000 people, including 1,800 warriors. Major Marcus Reno's scouts reported the camp's location, and Terry sent Custer's 7th Cavalry to intercept it. On June 25, 1876, Custer launched a premature attack without waiting for reinforcements. The plan was disastrous, and Custer's entire force of approximately 200 men was killed. This battle, known as the Battle of Little Bighorn, marked the last major victory for the Sioux and their allies. The following months were devastating for the native forces. Both the Sioux and Cheyenne suffered numerous defeats and heavy losses. Sitting Bull fled to Canada, while Crazy Horse surrendered in 1877 but was killed while resisting imprisonment. Sitting Bull returned in 1881 and surrendered at Fort Buford, later being moved to the Standing Rock Agency. In 1890, he was killed while resisting arrest for his support of the Ghost Dance movement. The Ghost Dance movement, started by the Paiute mystic Wovoka, gave hope to the disheartened Sioux and other tribes. Wovoka taught that the Ghost Dance would restore their way of life, bringing back the buffalo, reviving their ancestors, and removing white settlers from the plains. Believers also thought Ghost Dance shirts would protect them from bullets. Alarmed by the movement, the U.S. government banned the Ghost Dance and sent Indian police to arrest Sitting Bull. A confrontation ensued, and Sitting Bull, along with 6 of his followers, was killed. The violence culminated at Wounded Knee Creek on December 29, 1890, when Bigfoot and his followers were intercepted by the 7th Cavalry under Major S.M. Whitside. While camped for the night, a rifle discharged, sparking chaos. Colonel James Forsyth ordered his troops to fire, and artillery was used to slaughter men, women, and children attempting to flee. More than 250 Sioux, including Bigfoot, were killed in the massacre, marking the tragic end of the Sioux' 40-year struggle to preserve their lands and way of life. After the fighting ended, Native societies faced systematic efforts to assimilate them into American culture. The U.S. government forcibly sent Native children to boarding schools under the motto, "Kill the Indian, save the man." These schools aimed to erase Native languages, traditions, and identities, causing lasting trauma as children were removed from their families and communities. This marked the beginning of a new, painful chapter for Native peoples in the 20th and 21st centuries. Native children sent to boarding schools were stripped of their cultural identities. They were forced to wear American clothing, given English names, had their hair cut, and were forbidden to speak their native languages. Traditional religions and ceremonies were outlawed. The primary goal was to assimilate Native children into American society by teaching academic studies in English and vocational skills like farming, aiming to replace their traditional lifestyles. These schools were often overcrowded